Right. Thanks, Don. And conscious of the challenge of getting across discussions and the social component of what we're doing as well. So I'm going to rip through a few of the slides and points we wanted to make around sustainability and climate in our sector. But it's something that, even though MLA's been on this path now, supporting the industry since 2017, it's become very topical in recent times, and particularly with the methane pledge, and this week with COP27, which is the United Nations meeting in Egypt. So I'll get through the bits that I have as quick as I can, so I've got a chance for any questions. And a couple of the team said there was a couple of questions yesterday about a few other topics around influences and traceability, which I'll make sure we get enough time to cover as well. So we're moving into a very interesting time with sustainability, and the government signing up to the methane pledge just recently raised a couple of really interesting points, challenges, opportunities for us. And the one I think that has been becoming more and more visible to me in the last few months is there's not a great appreciation for the progress that the industry's already made, and there's not a great appreciation for why and how we're going about that. And if we think about the methane pledge, which 65% of our export countries have signed, which people can extrapolate that out to being a Risto export, but it's actually not. But it's also 130 odd countries have signed it already. But it's actually a non-binding pledge to reduce our methane production as a country by 30% over a 10-year period. Largely it's focused at industrial activities, so fossil fuels. The mention of agriculture is pretty limited in all of the pledge discussions, and certainly from our government point of view, it's quite limited as well. But for context, the red meat sector over the last 4.5 years, or 4 years, has reduced our contribution to the greenhouse gas emissions inventory by 59%. So nearly double what the methane pledge is planning in the next 10 years, and that's since 2005. So we're already well along the way. But more importantly, the focus of things like carbon neutral by 2030, so the CN30 plan, the focus of that is very much about how do we think about our industry's engagement with an impact on the environment at the same time as being profitable and productive, having intergenerational sustainability, and then leaving the environment in better shape. Unfortunately, what's happened in the last couple of weeks is that we've seen significant attention around the methane pledge, and we've seen an extrapolation of the risk that potentially creates for our industry, which again has created a fair bit of unnecessary concern given the progress we've already made and given the things that we actually have in place to stay in front of that. So it's very important that we keep these things in perspective, and we're very conscious of the global view about sustainability in animal agriculture, but also we put most of our efforts into the things that we can do that are still going to be driving productivity and profitability for our industry. The most important, so COP27, that's the meeting in Egypt, the UN meeting. It's the 27th meeting since the first commitment was made around the climate, so that's why it's called COP27. It's an annual meeting, largely of all the UN members, but it's the UN members that have signed up on these environmental commitments. And there's a number of representatives from Australia that are there. We'll have a couple of people there supporting the NFF and the Australian government. But the most important message that could come from that meeting is that animal agriculture didn't create the problem, but we're absolutely part of the solution. And it's that message which sits as part of and alongside things like CN30, but it's also so well represented in the Australian red meat sector. So we've had a lot of discussion about the methane pledge and what it might mean and how it might be a challenge or have an impact on us. But the Australian red meat sector is actually the gold standard for how an industry can be profitable and productive, how it can create greater sustainability for the industry as far as longevity and its ability to continually produce high quality food for our customers and clients around the world and consumers, but also reduce our impact on the environment or manage that in a better way. But too often we end up with our industry being maligned and seen as the scapegoat or the target for criticism, and mostly very, very unfairly and quite often dishonestly. So how we go about telling that story more proactively and more positively is incredibly important. But the message has to be, animal agriculture did not create this problem, and it's absolutely part of the solution. Not only is it part of the solution, but it's actually one of the best solutions, and it's one of the only solutions that's already demonstrating how you can actually do that. And that's the part of the message that we've got to make sure that we absolutely tell better. So if we think about the meeting in Egypt, there'll be a whole bunch of ambition that people will have from that. There'll be a whole bunch of discussion about what should or shouldn't be done. But one of the most important things from our point of view is that message ringing through somewhere that animal agriculture didn't create the problem, but we're absolutely part of the solution. And not only are we part of the solution, but we're one of the few industries that's demonstrated how you actually execute that and how you become part of that solution over time. So CN30, carbon neutral by 2030 was a goal that was set in 2017 at the MLA AGM. And it's been really interesting seeing the progression of how that's perceived by the industry. And, there's that saying about, success has many fathers, but failure's an orphan. When people ask me what's the most important single thing that's actually been done for the red meat sector around positively positioning ourselves in this climate space, and it was Richard Norton standing up at the AGM and saying, based on this CSIRO report, which says if we have the right investment in research and development, the right policy environment, the red meat sector can be carbon neutral in 10 years, and they set a goal of 2030. At the time, there were many people, and anybody who's really honest with themselves, probably all of us, certainly me, were pretty sceptical and thought, what a crazy thing to do. But it was incredibly brave, and now the number of people that are very proud, grateful, appreciative of the fact that we've had a 4 or 5 year run-up to an issue that's now becoming very, very important and topical for others is an incredibly important thing for us to remember. And I think it's one of those demonstrations of what we can do as an industry and how we can use our industry organisations like MLA to set ambitious goals and try and find ways to set us up in the best possible way that we can to deliver against those. And what we're seeing now with things like the methane pledge and the discussions that are happening more broadly on a global scale around sustainability, the run-up that we've actually had in this space puts us in incredibly good shape for our industry being a good example of how you can actually be driving an improved relationship between our industry and the environment through measures which are largely productivity driven. And that's an important component of how we want to think about things going forward. So, carbon neutrality and the CN30 goal, it doesn't need to come at the cost of livestock numbers or sector productivity. And it's actually as much about building and growing productivity to help provide those solutions as well. So there's a roadmap looking at a range of areas for us to focus on. So this leadership piece, how do we get a collective view about taking this forward? And then there's these two big chunks in the middle around emissions avoidance and carbon storage. So how do we reduce the emissions that are produced by the sector, and how do we find ways to store carbon? Interestingly, and we see examples of this quite often when we talk about a technology or a solution or an intervention which provides us with an opportunity to either reduce our emissions or capture carbon. And more often than not, somebody has the example as to why that won't work, which is one of the things we're really good at in our industry. We're good at the negative view. But what we have to do when we're thinking about a solution or a goal like CN30 is the suite of solutions that collectively will allow us on an enterprise by enterprise basis to get there. There's not going to be a silver bullet. There absolutely isn't going to be a silver bullet. But developing the range or the suite of tools and solutions and interventions and products that will allow an enterprise to capture each of those going forward. And there's a couple of really good examples for us to think about that we've not focused on, but have been part of the development. If you go back 5 years and you said to anybody, or you said publicly, I think we can reduce the amount of methane produced by a ruminant, you would have had pretty broad criticism and disagreement, right? 5 years ago, we didn't really think it was possible to reduce the methane being produced by a ruminant. Now, we actually have multiple commercial products, which are early stage commercial products. So one in the Asparagopsis seaweed product, and the other 3NOP or Bovair, which is the DSM synthetic version of the same sort of thing. And trials of both those products demonstrate you can reduce methane produced by a ruminant by 90%. Now, how exactly those products work and how available they are and how much they're going to cost, those are commercial things that will work out over time, and industry will work that out over time, as we have done with all our other solutions. But the most important thing is we've got multiple demonstrations of how we can now reduce the methane produced by a ruminant through supplements. The very quick next question or the next comment is, well, that's great, but you can't do it in a broad-scale pasture environment. Well, I reckon decades ago there was probably somebody saying there's no way we could supplement phosphorus in a broad-scale pasture environment. Yet it's now practice that is, it's now best practice. That is one of the greatest productivity improvements that we have in the north. You get $7 or $8 return for every dollar that you invest in it. We don't go around and measure every single animal to make sure he's been eating his phosphorus allowance, but we invest in the technology and we know there's a solution. We'll find ways as an industry to apply these things that give us benefit, and that might be through blocks, it might be through water medication systems that we already use, it might be through slow release, biodegradable boluses or similar. But most importantly, there's a demonstration that through supplementation we can reduce methane produced by an animal. Now, while that helps us on the path to CN30, more importantly, it gives us this great evidence and defence of the criticism of the cow. The cows are the problem. No, they're really not. The main reason why people target cows as a problem is because everybody recognises a cow and they can blame the cow, and most of the people in the world, if something is done about the cows, it's probably not going to personally impact them, and it means they then don't have to make any consumer decisions about turning off their air conditioner or being less of a consumer and buying less new clothes or driving their car less or whatever it might be. So the poor old cow gets very unfairly maligned, but building the evidence to support how we can manage that better in a more effective way is incredibly important for us telling this story. The other one I want to quickly mention is about soil carbon sequestration. And there's many broad views about soil carbon sequestration and what it can and can't do. And the best example I have from a few years ago is unsolicited. I had in the same week an email from 2 staff members who are both working in this space. So I assume they were on my side. And one of them sent me a message that said, I've been thinking about this soil carbon sequestration piece and people's discussion about high performance subtropical pastures and what that might mean in the north, and I really think it's being overblown and I really don't think there's anything in it. I thought that's a bit disappointing. Then a couple of days later I get another unsolicited email from a staff member saying, I've been thinking about this soil carbon sequestration thing and high performance subtropical pastures and the sorts of things we could potentially do in the north, and I think this actually might solve the whole problem all by itself. So, okay, so that's probably a better result. Later that week I was talking to a mate and I was telling them this story, and they said, well, the problem? The problem is that there's not enough evidence to support either of those views. However, we believe there's something in this and that it's absolutely something we should focus on as an industry, and there's benefit in how we work that out. Here we are a couple of years later, and we've actually worked a bit more out on that front, and we know it's going to be very helpful for us. But the really interesting thing is that the third guy that I spoke to worked for WWF. Right? So the most reasonable person I spoke to that week was the panda guy. Right? So we've got to be really conscious of the breadth of views. And let's just be really clear, that's not where we go as a source of information or support as a starting point. We absolutely go for productivity and how we actually drive things forward. But it was a really good reminder about this is early stage, this is new. We've been spending thousands of years working out how man can have a negative impact on the environment that we live in, and we've got really good at it. And the solutions are going to be incredibly sophisticated. They're not going to be easy, they're going to be hard, they're going to take time, and they're going to take a commitment from a range of us to get in front of. As an industry, we're further advanced down that path than anybody else. We've been more proactive about it than anybody else. And one of the huge benefits of doing that is that we've been able to do it with a focus on productivity and profitability and intergenerational industry sustainability at the same time. So there's this great first mover advantage that we have, and how we build on that is incredibly important. So since 2005, 58% reduction in contribution from the red meat sector to the National Greenhouse Emissions Inventory. And that's been done from a range of things. And a chunk of it's through land use and land use change, so not as much clearing, particularly in Queensland. So some of it's been, negative policy driven from other spaces. But we absolutely should claim the benefit from that if we've had to take the impact of it, so we absolutely should take the benefit from it. But it's also a demonstration of how you can actually move the needle as far as our interaction with the environment's concerned. It's also important to remember the role that we play going forward. And when we look at where livestock are produced in Australia, and particularly where red meat's produced in Australia, we cover a bit more than 50% of the total land area, and I know it's more sophisticated than these two circles, but largely this is where the majority of the numbers are. And of that country, there's very little else that you can actually do with it. The reason why we run livestock there is because it's the best thing that we can actually do with that country. Only 8% of our country in Australia is suitable for cropping, and largely we've actually got all that developed already. So the opportunity for us to be changing our production systems and still be able to have positive and productive output is actually pretty limited. So we've got this opportunity to take land which we're putting to really good use, and in so many cases making it more productive, more sustainable, less erosive, looking after it better, leaving it in better shape than what it was previously, and use it in a very productive and profitable way, producing a high quality, very nutritious food which is in demand around the world, but also leaving the broader environment in better shape. And back to the soil carbon sequestration point, we build up soil carbon, and that's a great way to capture carbon that's in the atmosphere, but it's also, as we know from our base 101 soil science, it increases our water holding capacity. So we end up getting greater utilisation from the rain that falls. So we're capturing carbon, but we're also getting more use out of the rain that we have as well. So we've got those productivity benefits that flow on. And it's important as we stack all of these potential solutions, interventions, technologies together, that we keep a track of the benefit that they're providing, not just in our contribution to the greenhouse gas emissions inventory, but also to the productivity piece as well. The other piece for us to talk about on the journey, and what we've seen in the last month particularly, is the confusion around understanding the journey from where we are as a society, as a community, and our impact on the environment and our emissions, and how do we get to a point to that being better or less. So we've got our CN30 journey. So carbon neutral by 2030 means that we have no net emissions being produced. So we start here with the emissions we have. CN30, we end up with no net emissions coming out of the system. Along that path, there's this spot in the middle where the emissions that we're producing today are the same or less than the emissions that we produced over time or at a point in time. Because the big benefit, opportunity that we have with methane produced by livestock is that it has a much shorter cycle. So ruminants produce methane, but that methane cycles out of the system. It's biogenic. It comes back into the natural biological production cycle in about 10 to 12 years. So if we think about the commitments that are made at these big global meetings, so the Paris commitment, for example, by restricting the warming of the Earth by less than 1.5 degrees, in order to do that, it means that we need to produce less emissions than what are currently in the system. So on this journey from where we're emitting over here to no net emissions, there's this spot in the middle where, from a livestock point of view, if we're reducing the amount of emissions that we have today compared to 10 or 12 years ago, we're what's called climate neutral. So we're not adding any further to the warming of the atmosphere, because the emissions that we have today are less than the emissions that were produced 10 or 12 years ago that are cycling out of the system as part of the natural biological cycle. This is one of the beauties of livestock production that the fossil fuel industry, for example, doesn't have the advantage of. And so this is a long way around to saying Australian sheep industry is climate neutral, and that's fantastic. Right? So it'd be great if we could just say that and everybody would be happy, but there's the story behind it, and the way to think about it, it's this journey to carbon neutral. So we've started over here, we're in this middle point now with the sheep sector where the emissions being produced by our sheep sector are less than the emissions that are cycling out from 10 or 12 years ago, and that's a fantastic point along the way to being carbon neutral. But the cool bit about that, or the neat thing about that, is that it's not contributing any more to warming. Right? So when you think about these goals that are being set, we've got to limit our warming to 1.5 degrees. It's like, well, we're at 0 or less from a sheep industry point of view. So we're actually in good shape. So how we actually communicate that is obviously difficult, but it's really important. But it's also a demonstration of the progress that we're making. Just conscious of time, and climate neutral, beef is on the same path. So being able to manage the emissions that we have today compared to the ones that we've had previously. So going forward, there's a bunch of investments that we actually have in how we continue down this path to be carbon neutral by 2030. We've invested about 140 or 50 million in projects so far. We've got about the same lined up again, and that the combination of that total investment with a range of our partners is the current commitment down that path. But it's this suite of product solutions technologies which provides us with the opportunity then on an enterprise by enterprise basis to find a way to get ourselves to this carbon neutral position. But more importantly, in the meantime, it's building this evidence that supports not just the fact that we're the gold standard of an industry that's able to be profitable and productive, we're able to deliver a high quality product to our consumers here and around the world, but also do it in a way that provides us with intergenerational sustainability, and we're the absolute gold standard of how we do that. But we're also able to demonstrate the path that we're on to being carbon neutral by 2030. So you want one take-home message? Livestock agriculture did not actually create the challenge that everybody's talking about in the climate, but we are absolutely part of the solution. The solutions are going to need to be sophisticated, they're going to be hard. We've done more in this space than anybody else. We've got more planned than anybody else, and we actually should be seen as the heroes on the solution and not be the ones that are copying the criticism that we are. And the more we do about promoting that collectively, then the better off we'll be. happy to take some questions.
How are we going, ladies and gentlemen? Questions?
Yeah, I got one. John Klebeck from Wellard. Hear your frustration about not getting the message across on the beat up of the cattle and cows and livestock in general. Given that currently in Australia we've lost that battle at the moment, how do you see us going down in the next 6 to 12 months, given what's happened in New Zealand with Ardern taking the view of, their whole economy is agriculture, and she's taken the aggressive stance of a tax. So how do you see it playing out in the next 6 to 12 months? How do we get the momentum back the other way?
Yeah. So it's a really good topical thing to bring up. So we're nothing like New Zealand. The fact that we've actually had a plan in place, or we've been progressing down this path for the amount of time that we have, puts us in a very different position as far as the presentation of the industry. But more importantly, the support of our government for our sector is at polar opposites to what we've seen in New Zealand. So the Minister could not be clearer. He said it again on Tuesday at Senate estimates. There will be no carbon tax. There is no plan, no intention, no thought to have a carbon tax at all. And a big chunk of that is supported by the recognition by the department and the government of the efforts of the industry to date, and being able to demonstrate that we're actually making more progress in this space than anybody else. So we need to be aware of these things. We need to be aware of the potential risk of what might happen or what can happen in other parts of the world. But we're not in the same position, and the Minister could not be clearer about their lack of interest in taking that same approach. So while that's the case, now is the opportunity for us to double down on how we actually tell our story in a proactive way. How long have I got to rip through this? Okay, so I got a heads up about this yesterday, right? So here's a couple of really quick things that we prepared earlier. We run these consumer sentiment studies over the last 11 or 12 years, and the perception of consumers of our industry is much more positive than what we actually think. If you just listen to the commentary, you'd think that they're all against us. They're not. There's only 7% vegans and veggies. That's run at 7 or 8% for the last 12 years. Went to 9% last year, and I thought, crap, it's going to get away from us. This year it came back to 7. Of that 7%, 56% of them still eat meat. Right? So there's only actually 4% of people that really are vegans and veggies. More importantly, these are consumer outputs, right? They think about our positive contribution to the society. They feel good about our production. They think it's raised in a humane manner, and they think that we're ethical and trustworthy, right? But also, I'll just try and whip through a couple of these. The more people know about our industry, the more positive they are in their views of what we do. So the more we tell our story, the better off we are. These are the drivers of consumers' willingness to eat more and pay more. If they know more about our product, they're prepared to eat more of our product. We've got a massive suite of resources under this Australian Good Meat site, which we've been building. We've had for a while, but we've been building it significantly in the last 12 months. We're going to keep building to it. And the best thing we can all do is point forwards and tell the story. So all of the resources that are here, borrow, steal, copy, plagiarise them, put your own face on them, whatever it takes to get the message out there. Red Meat Green Facts, which was in your bag, using that as well. And one of the other things we've done is in the last 12, 18 months, we've engaged with 37 social influencers. Now, I don't have to point this out to you, but none of these people look like us, right? What we found, though, when we looked at this influencer space is that it wasn't so much we were being denigrated like we see sometimes in the press or we hear from the extremists, but it's that we weren't present in the conversation. So what we've been doing the last 12 months is working with these influencers to actually spread the positive message. And how do we actually get that message out? And how do we get that out to the much broader audience? And one of the things we often hear when we talk about this is somebody say, well, I've never seen that. It's like, and you're not our target market. And one of the challenges that we've got to get out of is how much we talk to ourselves about this, and we should still do that, but we've got to do it in a positive way. Let's talk to ourselves about how good things are and about how the good things we can do, but then also make sure that we talk to everybody else about the positive stuff as well. So absolutely understand the concern, but broadly, we're in fantastic shape, and the best thing we can do is actually keep looking forward and promote the positive message as much as we possibly can. Simon, might have to sing out.
G'day, Jason. Simon Lott, EnviroAg Australia. A couple of things that have been picked in my mind through yesterday and today. Number one is we have an Achilles heel in the red meat sector, which is transport. 90% of the fuel that we import, well, 90% of our fuel that we consume is imported. And about 73% of that is actually used in the transport sector, and the red meat sector is dependent on that transport. Transport is a huge greenhouse gas generator. Biodiesel would give us a huge greenhouse gas offset. Where does biofuel, biodiesel in particular, sit with MLA, the transport sector, and supporting the red meat industry, Jason?
After the round of the kitchen that I had with Dave Jones last night, quite a bit higher than it did before about 6 o'clock yesterday. It's not really a focus as a specific thing for MLA, given our livestock production support focus, but the transport piece is a very important component of the greenhouse gas emissions contribution, and it's certainly one of those things on the periphery of what we'll need to be looking at over time as far as that whole accounting piece. So huge opportunity. Not much has been done from a practical level with it yet, but it's certainly on the radar. We don't have anything in that space really at the moment, but it's something that's on the list. Yeah, that's right.
Going to have to shorten it up.
Okay.
Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have to, in the interest of time, but thanks, Jason. Good on you, mate.
All right. Thanks. Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you.